chance to introduce an old friend from the other side, Max Edling. Max Edling, who's going to be our speaker today. Max Edling, one of those scholars who every time I see him, sort of contradictory thing happens. First, he seems to get smarter, okay? He seems to get smarter. But then the second thing is he seems to get younger. Like he's one of these people that reverse ages. So as he gets younger looking, he's getting smarter. So that's the way it feels like sometimes I'm moving in the opposite direction, getting dumber and older. So Max is joining us today from London, where he is at King's College, London. So he's 6 hours ahead of us. It's a Friday night. I see we have a couple of English guests, and you guys all get the award for committed historians and intellectuals for coming in on a Friday night at 7 o'clock. We're very glad to have you. Max, I just found is been named Reader. I didn't realize this had happened a couple of years ago. Reader is his title. That's a big title if you're a second grader in the United States to be called a reader. But if you're in Britain, that's a really cool thing, and it's a sign of distinction, and distinction which he's earned. When you think about who's the sort of authority on the U.S. founding and the political development of the 18th and 19th centuries, Max's name is always one that pops into mind, if not the first one that pops into mind. And how I would characterize his scholarship, what I think is so good about it is that on the one hand, he's really attuned to the kind of international dynamics in which the U.S. founding took place, really attuned to that. And was attuned to that before that was the sort of hot, trendy thing to do, I hasten to add. But yet he's also aware of the particularity of the American experience. And he's able to kind of synthesize and merge both of those perspectives. And that's sounds simple, but I think it's really hard to do. It's a hallmark of his first book, Revolution in Favor of Government. A fresh take on 1787, part of a fiscal military state that one sees in the Atlantic world at that time, but in the United States context, one conditioned by a peculiar anti-statist political culture. He followed that up with Hercules in the Cradle. This was a book about kind of public finance and state making and empire building in the 19th century, which took some of the ideas from his first book forward and across space. And then he's here to talk to us today, if I'm not mistaken, about a new book that is soon to be out through Oxford University Press. A new take, fresh sort of take on the Constitution, entitled Perfecting the Union, National and State Authority in the U.S. Constitution. And that's what Max will be talking about today. I'm going to hand it over to him. He's going to talk for sort of normal paper, 45 minutes, give or take, and then we'll have time to ask questions. Please, if you want to ask a question, let me know in the chat and I'll call on you and we'll bring you up to do it. And we look forward to that. But without further ado, Max Edling.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay, everyone? If you don't protest, I will assume that you can. I am, in fact, not in London, but in Stockholm, in Sweden, because of the pandemic. At first, I couldn't travel to the UK, and then King's decided to do most of the teaching online. So I'm stuck in Stockholm. That means that it's actually past 8 o'clock at night, but it's not quite my bedtime yet. So I think I can keep going for a couple of hours. So thank you for that kind invitation, kind introduction, Jay, and thank you for the kind invitation to speak. It's really wonderful to be here, even if it's in virtual fashion. I've been curious about the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy ever since it was first set up, and ever since Jay left Oxford for Columbia. I don't know how well you know the UK academic system and the pecking order of universities, but it's quite clear. You've got Oxford and Cambridge at the very top, and then you've got other schools further down, and King's is one of those schools further down. Whenever someone, one of my colleagues from King's, gets the call from either Oxford or Cambridge, they're off in a flash. There's not even time to say goodbye. But you never ever hear of anyone leaving either of these places. So I bet when Jay decided to leave, that was a big moment in the history of Oxford University. And I bet they're still scratching their heads, asking themselves exactly what went wrong. So as someone doing the American founding, the Institute is, of course, an important and interesting place, and a place that I would love to learn more about. I would also like to thank you for being so accommodating about time. I know that you normally meet later in the day, and I'm sure this is quite inconvenient for a lot of you. I know that it also upsets your pursuit of happiness hours, so thank you all for being here. As Jay said, I'm going to talk about my new book, which is expected in December, fingers crossed. And what I thought I'd do is first explain my ambition with the book and the reasons why I wrote it. And second, briefly talk you through the content. And third, explain how the book is really only a kind of stepping stone for a larger project that I'm working on. And I would be really interested to hear your views on the ideas I have about this larger project. I will try to keep it shorter than 45 minutes, so possibly, I don't know, 30, 35 is what I'm aiming for. So the ambition of the book is to explain just how the Constitution matches the American political development in the founding period. And this may sound like an old and tired topic, but I think recent scholarship makes it pertinent again. My view of the Constitution is that it mattered a great deal in some ways, but hardly at all in other ways. Most important, I believe that the Constitution's significance to domestic development in the early US has been overstated. And there are two reasons for this overemphasis, I think. First, there's a tendency to write US political history as a national story. This disregards the state level, where often more important things happened. So scholars are prone to read back into the founding what the United States has become in modern times, namely a polity where the state governments, although they do have considerable autonomy, can still be forced by the federal government to conform to national standards in the organization and management of their social, economic, and civic life. Second, there is the very natural tendency to view the founding as a transformative event. I mean, it could hardly be otherwise, right? We are talking about the birth of the United States after all. But although the founding did change some things, the people in charge were also trying to preserve a lot of things. For example, the common claim that the American founding was this great leap forward in the struggle for democracy, equality, and individual rights is exaggerated. To figure out how the Constitution at the same time mattered and did not matter, how it transformed some things, preserved other things, I focus on the remit, the national or federal government under the Constitution, and I contrast that with the remit of the state governments in the American Federal Union. I ask what the tasks or duties or powers or authorities or responsibilities of the national government were, and I ask what the tasks or duties or powers or authorities or responsibilities of the state governments were. When he spoke about the Constitution, commented on the Constitution, James Madison spoke about the problem of determining how to run what he called the line between national and local government responsibilities. In the Constitutional Convention, he first said it was impractical or even impossible to draw a precise line between these two jurisdictions. But Madison and his allies soon found that both convention delegates and American citizens demanded to know where this line would run. Skeptics argued that should the national government become too strong, it would absorb and destroy the state. And this was something that few, if anyone, wanted. The Federalist supporters of the Constitution therefore claimed to fend off their anti-Federalist critics by presenting the new national government as a government of enumerated powers that would not infringe on essential state authority and state rights. After the Constitutional Convention had ended, Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson saying that the framers had worked really hard to draw a line of demarcation which would give to the general government every power requisite for general purposes and leave to the states every power which might be most beneficially administered by them. Despite Madison's initial misgivings, the outcome of the Constitutional Convention was a commitment to the preservation of the two levels of government in the structure of the American Federal Union, although the outcome was also a considerably stronger national government. Part of this settlement was establishing the principle that the two levels of government would be concerned with different things. There would be a line separating the respective spheres of action. That line divided international from domestic government concerns, and the Constitution tasks the national government with the former, but left the latter with the state governments. So in the book, I present the framing and adoption of the Constitution as a reform of the American Union that had been created by the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. And my thesis can be summed up like this. The Constitution profoundly transformed the structure of the American Union, thereby making the national government more effective, but it did not transform the fundamental purpose of the Union. The purpose of the Union, I argue, was to manage the relations between the American states on the one hand and between the American states and foreign powers on the other hand. The national government was created to deal with defense, diplomacy, including foreign trade, American-Indian relations, and the development of the Western territories. It was also created to deal with interstate conflict resolution with the management of the internal market or the customs union. So obviously, the national government did have some impact on domestic development, but I think it's important to understand that its main focus lay elsewhere. In the larger project that I will hopefully now embark upon, domestic developments are central. And for that project, getting the Constitution sort of out of the way is a necessary step to clear the path for a new approach, something I call a Decentred approach to the American founding. As readers of the book will find, I am very much indebted to Peter Odoff, but I'm also heavily indebted to scholars like David Hendrickson, Dan Halsebosch, Mary Sarah Bilder, the late Leonard Sadowski, and others. These scholars share an approach that interprets the meaning of the Constitution in the context of the principles and practice of federal union and international relations. I suppose I am also in some ways indebted to myself. As they mentioned, my first book presented the Constitution as a response to the perilous situation of the United States after independence, when it was a weak and marginal player in a highly competitive international state system dominated by monarchies and empires. So most of you will be familiar with the perspective I'm referring to, but I will briefly summarize it for those who are not. This perspective is sometimes called an international interpretation, sometimes it's called a unionist paradigm. I don't think there's a universally agreed name. I decided to go with unionist interpretation in the book. But if the name is unclear, the argument is not. Unionist scholars argue that the Constitution should not be interpreted as the fundamental or higher law of a nation state. Instead, it should be interpreted as an agreement between sovereign states. That's an older and less frequent meaning of the word Constitution. So the US Constitution is in fact two things at once. It's a compact of union, or a federal treaty, if you like, that regulates the relationship between the American states joining in union, but it is also a form of government for the common government of this union. So the unionist interpretation argues that the Constitution and the organization and institutions that the Constitution gave rise to matter to the international rather than to the domestic history of the United States. The impact that the Constitution had on the international history of the United States can be seen in two distinct ways. So first, the creation of a stable federal union transformed the relationship between the newly independent American states from a competitive and potentially destructive international state system to an organization that allowed for the peaceful resolution of interstate conflict. So this is why political thinkers have long presented federal union as an alternative to war, right? And it's also why Hendrickson named his book on the American founding peace. The second thing that, the second impact on the international history is through the way that federal union was a means allowing weak states, such as small American republics, to pool their resources so that they could act in common against outside competitors in the international state system, and thereby preserve their independence and promote their interests. Now, if we contrast this unionist interpretation with an alternative perspective on the founding, we can see more clearly what is distinctive about this interpretation. And the contrasting perspective that I'm going to use is the progressive interpretation associated with Charles Beard and the many scholars inspired by him. To my mind, at least, the progressive interpretation has shaped the study of the founding more than any other aspect out there. And comparing the two, here are some of the more important differences. Where the progressives believe the principal political agents to be classes, the unionist interpretation concentrates on polities, such as European monarchies, American states, the Federal Union, and American Indian nations. Where the progressives see the principal historical dynamic springing from class struggle, the unionist interpretation finds it in geopolitical competition and sectional tension. Where the progressives find the principal political agenda of the constitutional reform movement to be the redistribution of property and status from ordinary people to the elite, the unionist interpretation describes it as an attempt to defend US territorial integrity and the national interest from competitors in the western borderlands and on the Atlantic Ocean. And where the progressives identify the principal outcome of the founding to be the creation of a bourgeois state that faced inwards to make North America safe for capitalism, the unionist interpretation identified as the creation of a stronger federal union that faced outwards to stand up to European powers and to conquer the North American continent. All right, that's enough, I think, about the background and my ambitions and reasons for writing this book. So let me say something about the structure and content of the book, and I'm happy to answer questions about individual chapters in the Q&A session, because this is going to be quite brief. It is a short book. It has only 4 chapters, long introduction and long conclusion though. I'm hoping that maybe it can be used in teaching, and for that reason I've tried to set out my argument as clearly and as boldly as I can. And I've also tried to base what I say on empirically verifiable claims or evidence. So my idea is that students, if they ever get to read this book, should be able to assess and question both the argument, but also crucially the evidence that I used to build the argument. So, because I think that this so-called unionist interpretation is not as well known as it should be, and also because I owe the scholars who have developed it so much, the first chapter is my attempt to synthesize this literature into a coherent argument about the Constitution. I've already spoken enough about the unionist interpretation, so there's no need to say more about the first chapter, I think. In the second chapter, I revisit largely familiar sources to the creation of the Constitution, and my focus here is on the framers' ideas about the Union. I set out my main argument that the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution was a transition marked by structural change and continuity of purpose. So the federal government created by the Constitution was meant to deal with international and interstate matters. Most other government business would be left to the states. The third chapter does something that I hope is a little more fresh. It is a conceptual history of the term internal police. So why this term and what on earth does internal police mean? Well, today we associate police with the boys in blue, but the original meaning of the word comes from the Greek word for city-state, the polis. In the early modern period, before the modern police force took form, the term covered all kinds of social and economic regulation happening at both state and local city level. In the debates on the constitution, the term internal police was actually used quite frequently. And when I went back in time a bit, it turned out that the term internal police was also used when American colonists protested against the actions of Parliament in the early stages of the revolution. Now, in both contexts, internal police was used to define the governmental powers that ought to be invested in the local government and which the central government, whether it was Parliament or Congress, should leave alone. So there's both strong consistency in how the term is used in the founding period, and there's also strong agreement that leaving internal police matters to the colonies or to the states was a sound and central principle of American political organization. But if the term played an important function in the political debates of the time, it is also frustratingly vague. In all my readings, I couldn't find a single definition of the term saying by internal police is meant A, B, and C. That only seems to appear with reference works like Webster's Dictionary a bit into the 19th century. But by analyzing the uses of the term, it became clear to me that it was a very broad term that covered virtually everything an 18th century government did, apart from defense and the administration of justice. So the ultimate purpose or aim of internal police regulations was to create an opulent, refined, and well-ordered society. And this included regulating things like markets, labor relations, the inspection of goods, public investment, incorporation of businesses, banking, coin, weights and measures, transportation, marriage and child rearing, education, taverns, gambling, livestock, health, morals, and many more things. It also covered the regulation of property and what we would call individual rights. Even if this term was vague, there was agreement between federalists and anti-federalists that the states would regulate their internal police also after the Constitution had set up a more powerful national government. Understanding the concept of internal police therefore helps us understand what the state governments were supposed to do in the American Federal Union. Moving on to the fourth chapter, here I also do something a little different compared to conventional approaches to the Constitution. I had positive response from manuscript readers on this part of the book, and I hope to expand it greatly in this type of investigation in the future in another project. But what I do in this chapter is a quantitative analysis of the roughly 400 laws passed by Congress between 1789 and 1797. And I use an elaborate classification schema to determine the subject matter of these laws. And I placed the record of Congress alongside that of the British Parliament and of the Pennsylvania Assembly to determine what the federal government actually did in the first few years after the adoption of the Constitution. So when trying to understand the Constitution, what we normally do is we investigate the run-up to the Constitutional Convention, the Convention itself, and the ratifications process. But in this chapter, I look for the meaning of the Constitution in events after the fact, so as to speak. And this is, of course, is a little unusual. But I think the strategy can be justified in this case. It's generally accepted that Congress and the Washington administration were heavily dominated by Federalists. It's also generally accepted that the Constitution was meant to address urgent and pressing matters that were critical to the future and the success of the United States, although there's really no agreement on what those matters were. Against this background, it seems reasonable to assume, I think, that the first Congresses tried to realize whatever political agenda had propelled the Founding Fathers to the Constitutional Convention. So this analysis, this quantitative analysis of US and Pennsylvania legislation in the period 1789 to 1797 further supports the central claim of the book, that the national government was concerned with international and interstate affairs and the state governments with domestic matters. But it also shows that the US was a different place from Britain. The British Parliament legislated on both foreign and domestic matters. In the US, there was a division of labor between the two levels of government. And this will come as no surprise to those familiar with early modern federal unions. But I was pleased to see that the early US adhered so neatly to the model, and if it hadn't done so, I probably wouldn't have been able to include this chapter in the book. So, huge relief. I want to end this talk the way that I end the book, with a discussion of the implications of the Unionist interpretation for studies of the American founding. So, needless to say, I find the interpretation of the Constitution convincing. That's obviously why I wrote the book, but I also find it quite troublesome. Ever since our profession began, American historians have made sense of the founding by employing modernization narratives. And they try to explain how the founding played a part in the transition to liberal democracy and to a market economy. And the progressive interpretation is just one example of this kind of approach. So historians ask questions about the nature of the society that emerged from American independence, and also about the role of documents like the Constitution in shaping that society. But I think we need to ask ourselves what the Unionist interpretation contributes to these debates. And at first glance, it seems to me that the answer can only be actually very little. So the Unionist interpretation shifts the debate about the meaning of the Constitution. This is new and this is interesting, but the perennial questions about the nature of the new American Republic are still there, and they refuse to go away. In international history, territorial expansion, imperial organization, indigenous removal, all these things are tremendously important, but they don't cover all or even the most significant domestic developments happening in the founding period. And I think that as historians of the founding period, we need to be able to talk about these things. So the challenge then of the Unionist interpretation, seems to me, is how do we talk about domestic developments in the early US without centering our accounts on the Constitution and without centering those accounts on the federal government. And given how the field is organized, this may seem like quite a daunting challenge, but once we accept it, I think it can also be quite liberating. And that's because I think it allows us to approach the founding era in new ways. And thinking about this perspective and writing this book, I've come to think that this is actually the most significant contribution of the Unionist interpretation to founding studies, that it forces us to think about domestic developments in new ways. So if we accept what the Unionist interpretation says about the Constitution, I think there are at least three directions to take founding scholarship in. The first and most obvious is exploring the international history of the United States. These are things that I've already alluded to: territorial expansion, indigenous removal, trade, wars, diplomacy, etc. The second is to look closer at developments at the state level. And I think that if we do, we will find that narratives of political and economic modernization make a lot of sense there. because the states, much more than the federal government, regulated American economic and social life. So Christopher Pearl, for example, has a wonderful book on Pennsylvania in the Revolutionary era just out. Another example is Brian Murphy's book on New York. William Nowak's The People's Welfare is an older example of a work speaking to this topic of social regulation and internal police. Further back, we have the so-called Commonwealth School with the Handlins and Louis Hartz, and they're concerned with how the state shapes the American economy. And I hope we will see many more studies of the states in the founding era in coming years. There's no reason, I think, why these have to be bland institutional histories. I think they can be colorful stories of conflicts of interest and clashing social visions. I think the kinds of perspectives we associate with the progressive interpretation will make a lot of sense in such studies. The idea of conflicts between classes and struggles of the distribution of wealth. So a third possibility is to explore perennial questions of liberty, democracy, and rights in early America by turning away from the Constitution and using what I call a decentred approach to the founding. And this is the avenue that I am now pursuing myself. So in my current project, I'm trying to figure out how the American Revolution laid the foundation for a democratic social order that combined unsurpassed equality and opportunity with institutionalized inequality and oppression, as I once put it in an essay. So in this project, I want to explain the subordinate status of so-called marginalized groups, who were in fact the majority of the population, so women, children, servants, the poor, so-called not whites, and enslaved people. I want to explain that subordinate status, not as the unfortunate but inevitable shortcoming of the American Revolution, and not as the failure to realize the promise of a society where all men are created equal, but actually as a key element of the political order coming out of the American founding. So quite a deliberate thing, not the result of oversight, not the result of being unable to do anything about it. Key then to me is that in this history of liberty and rights, it's actually very little of significance happening at the national level. Things like marriage, slavery, servitude, the age of majority, these were all things that were determined by the colonies before independence and by the states after independence. And if we want to learn about things like the rights of white husbands and masters over their wives, their children, their servants, these things are not spelled out in the Bill of Rights. They're not spelled out even in state constitution or state bills of rights. These rights were spelled out in the common law of husband and wife, the law of father and child, the law of master and servant, and the law of slavery. But it seems to me that the only way to write an inclusive history of liberty and rights in the American founding, one that goes beyond the slogans of the Declaration of Independence, to my mind, the rather empty slogans of the Declaration of Independence, to describe the reality of life in early America, we need to take this decentered approach to the study of the American founding. And such history, I believe, has to pay attention to the multiple legalities of early America and to the actions and not least the inaction of different governmental institutions in the multi-layered Federal Republic. So in my particular case, this is a story that takes me way beyond the federal government and way beyond the Constitution. It takes me through the states and their laws and constitutions. It takes me through local government, it takes me through local regulations, and I end somewhat unexpectedly in the lowest and what I have come to think of as the most important level of the vast American federal structure, namely household government. And I think I'm actually going to end there. I think it's much more fun if you ask me questions than if I keep going about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Max, for that. Let's all give Max a virtual applause. Perfect on so many levels, but not least because there's a lot to chew on there. The floor is open. I have Grace Mallon is on deck. Okay, you're on deck. But we ask normally if any of our graduate students would like to ask the first question. So Grace, you can swing the bat and get warmed up while we take something from a graduate student. Who'd like to start here?
Thanks, Jay. I've been enjoying the sports metaphors. Thanks for that really interesting talk. I'm really excited about this book because it's obviously going to have really important implications for my work. And I wanted to ask you about, you've mentioned William Novak, sort of want to ask you, how do your arguments about how we should understand state government, how do they interact with the arguments that William Novak is making and the arguments that Gary Gerstle is making about what state government is and is doing?
So, is it okay for me to answer that, Jay? Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. I think Nowak has this idea that in the book that the states are places that allow democratic government to happen, and he takes a rather positive view to the notion of regulating society. In my view, is I guess more critical, because the fact is that these internal police regulations to a large extent is about ordering society in a certain way, and it's about putting a lot of pressure on people who are even more marginalized than the people I mentioned. So that would be poor people, vagrants, etc., drunkards, prostitutes, single women. It's not a caring a regime in any way. It's a regime that tries, as far as I can see, to secure the property of the key members of the American Republic. So that would be the householders, household heads, mostly that would be white males. With Gary, I think so. My issue with his book is I think he takes the critical view of internal police, but he wants to claim that the federal government from the very start tried to strike down these restrictions and somehow uphold and defend individual rights, and I'm skeptical of that. So my argument would be that the federal government isn't really around very much when it comes to the regulation of individual rights and liberties for a very long time. I mean, way into the 20th century. So that, I think, would be my answer. I don't know if that's okay, or right.
That makes a lot of sense.
Happy with that, right? Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, so Grace was actually the leadoff hitter there to get my metaphors right. Who's next in the batter's box?
I got one, Jay.
Okay.
So Max, great talk. Enjoyed that. Now, so what I was interested in is, you used the language about the founding, right? But it sounded to me like when you explained the founding, well, the really way to understand the founding is to look at internal police laws and local regulation, the common law. That's social history, isn't it? I mean, you're describing the methods by which people traditionally did social history. That's how history of the family and stuff was done through the local laws. So I guess I'm not quite understanding that is, I don't imagine that you're calling for people to not study the founding, but in effect you kind of are, unless I'm misunderstanding.
No, that's a good question. I suppose what I would say to that is a political history that pays no attention to all the people that were excluded from politics is to me not an inclusive political history. So yes, I guess my project is about taking those social history perspectives and saying that they're actually central to political history in this period. So I'm enormously impressed with the legal scholars and others who have been working on things like family history. I think they're saying enormously important things about the nature of this society, and I think we will understand a very small part of it if we are only looking at the citizenry, people who go out voting, and the people who are the dominant persons in this society. So I wouldn't be unhappy with that characterization. I need to maybe think through the implications a little bit and how to make the claim that the personalist are political, I guess, the socialist are political. But yes, you're right that these are the people that and the perspectives that I think are really important to understand the politics of the time. And I guess I would say also that the more I look at this kind of society, the more it seems to me that the political position of a citizen or an elector or whatever is really founded on their private position. So their role in this social context, that is what gives them the material foundation that allows them to be political participants. So separating the two won't work for me. I'm sorry, I'm giving you a rambling answer.
No, I was being the, just it's, and obviously all those things are important. I mean, I think that that was part of what we were trying to do with that Beyond the Founders book, is to do that thing you're talking about, just Max Edling calling for history from the bottom up. That's new. Even though obviously that's, I see what you mean. I guess the other thing, follow up to that, Max, is that how much of those kinds of that sort of social basis that you're talking about, how much of that's even founding? I mean, how much of that's, when you talk about internal police, you're talking about like kind of the internal, the sort of local government in its nature, right? Or there's some phrase at Hamilton, it's like it's the nature of government itself everywhere. And it's the carryover from the way that local government would have operated just about any place where there'd been governments. So if you're talking about things that are kind of from the nature of government or from the nature of European government, then I mean, is that part of the project you're outlining? Is trying to distinguish what's being founded here, or because it seems to me that like starting to, it would be probably claiming too much to claim that I mean, and this I think is the tenor of sometimes you get, is that okay, well, we're going to look at local laws in the United States and talk about the patriarchy and slavery as though those things were invented here, which I don't think they were, probably. They certainly, there were changes, so absolutely, but you see what I mean? It's not only is it different from the founding, but it's not even founded.
Yes, good points. I suppose I'd be happy to think about the founding as a big non-event in many respects.
Yeah.
Looking at the continuity and preservation, but I think in some ways worth looking at, there is a how to put this, there is a strengthening of the rights of some people, the rights to the labor and bodies and property of other people in the revolution. And I think there's a great deal of going on in the political realm also. So The way I'm doing this, because it's quite hard to get a handle on, so I'm approaching the question by looking at the first generation of law professors and the books that they wrote. And you can see that they're concerned with things like a distinction between different types of rights. And you could certainly say that some of the political rights changed in this period of civic rights, whatever you want to call them. Whereas what they at the time would call social or relational rights didn't change much at all. And I think that's important. The fact that it doesn't change, the fact that there's this wish to preserve a society that is structured in a fairly hierarchical fashion, and it's certainly not an equal society. And I don't know. I mean, to me, it says something of interest about the American founding. I certainly buy your point that that maybe I need to be more careful about.
Oh well, you're gonna have to be more careful. I was just making the point that we should, if we're gonna do this, maybe the founding needs to be dispensed with. Maybe it's the continuation, you know, or at least some things are the continuation. Yeah. We need to be distinct about what's continuation and what's being founded.
Okay, so I want to just cut in here because I know that Ken Owen, if you mentioned Pennsylvania, Ken Owen is going to be on the case, and I know he's chomping at the bit, but I would like to, with apologies for cutting you off, Jeff, I'd just like to invite the graduate students to enter into the fray here. And Ty, do you want to ask a question? All right.
Hi, I would be interested to ask, do you think your position as a non-American scholar studying the United States influences your scholarship and maybe contributes to how you've got, I guess, a more contrarian position to the bulk of the scholarship? I guess in the sense of, you don't have to hold these truths to be self-evident because it's not your constitution. You can kind of hit it with a stick and say, I disagree. So I'd be interested to see how, I guess, you got into this scholarship. And do you think it influences how you approach it?
Right, thanks for that. That is an interesting question. I was involved in a big project with one of Jay's Oxford colleagues about 10 years ago, when we the project gathered European historians of the US, and it asked precisely that question. Does it matter that we're writing the history of the US from the outside? So I think the book that came out of this project is called Historians Across Borders. And it was to me very interesting to be part of that and to talk to other people. I had thought that the outside thing was something that you know I really could contribute, and Americans are generally so nice about outside voices too. It's not like in my own country of Sweden where you wouldn't listen to a foreigner. No way. But Americans tend to be very, very generous and open, and they do listen to what foreigners have to say. So I thought, yes, absolutely, my outside perspective is enormously important. But when we had this discussion with the other, the large group of European scholars, we soon discovered that actually there's so many different outside perspectives. There's not a single outside perspective on the US. So that outside perspective isn't really an outside perspective. It doesn't, that term doesn't really mean anything because you have your perspective for many different things, many different reasons. And the fact that you're outside of the US probably doesn't determine your perspective in any specific way. Also, I found that virtually everyone I cite and I read, and I agree with, are US-based American historians. So I don't think I'm in any way more critical. I mean, I've been accused of being you know, a right-wing Hamiltonian supporter of this and that. So I don't think I'm necessarily more critical than anyone else. There was something else I wanted to say to this that it slipped my mind. Maybe it'll come back later on.
The title of that book, Max, the original title was so much better than the Historians Across Borders or whatever it was. Remember
You
the
the
first
people?
title was You the People. I liked
Mm-hmm.
that. You the People.
Yeah.
Okay, we got just Ross next.
Hey everyone. First I want to say thank you to Max for giving his time to present his work to us. It was a great talk, so thank you for that. I had a question about your thoughts on sort of the breakdown of this treaty, this federal treaty that you described. So if this treaty is supposed to be sort of a differentiation of policing powers, internal policing for the states, external policing for the federal government, as the United States progresses across both space and time, that understanding breaks down, and the federal government starts sort of sharing internal policing with the states in a lot of ways, especially as you get further west. So if we think of things like the Bank of the United States and preferred bank depositories, the customs houses in the West, the federal land offices, the factory system, forts, armories, all of these things are federally controlled, and they are also really tied into internal policing in a lot of ways. So I was just curious about your thoughts about sort of the breakdown of that treaty over time, perhaps, and sort of the shared internal policing that actually happens, especially out in the US.
Well, I think you, as you say, you need to have a spatial dimension to the analysis as well, dividing the US into its heartland, that's the term I use, of the 13 republics when we start out, and then the marshlands, the West. And it's a whole different story in the federal territories for the simple reason that the federal government is the only game in town. So they're doing all the kinds of stuff that that a state government would do otherwise. Same thing in Washington, D.C. That's Congress legislates on these internal regulations for Washington, D.C. for a very long time too. It's also the case that there are certain police powers left to the federal government. So the post office is one important such thing. Also the common market that I mentioned, and that's another very important police matters. So weights and measures, coin, these sorts of things are typically listed when people talk about police powers or police regulations in the early modern period. So it's not that clear cut. There are certain powers given to the national government. Although I would say that they are fairly limited, and they're limited to certain things. Again, Western management of the Western territories and interstate relations. Another interesting aspect about police is the use of internal police. Seems to be an American thing. If you look at the term in elsewhere, it's usually just police. And I've not found a good place where that distinction is laid out. I think that would tell us something. Police regulations in general, you find most of it in the case of Pennsylvania legislation. The clearest examples are the regulations of the city of Philadelphia. And I think in general, it's actually at city level that you find thinking about the regulation of modern society most developed, and that's for the simple reason that this is where there's a density of people and a frequency of exchange, and that's where you need to regulate people and where there are new situations happening that call for regulation. I think if we take the long run, then early modern federal unions won't work in the modern era because the economy makes things far too complicated. Globalization and change. I mean, as someone working in the UK and trying to spend most of my time in the EU, I'm very much aware of how the EU is working not as the early US, because the EU is dabbling with internal matters of the member states all the time, and I think that's inevitable when you get to when you have a modern society. But of course, no one at the time of the constitution knew that that was going to happen. At least, not that many.
Okay, great. I've got a long queue here of professor nerd questions, and we're going to start clearing the decks of those. But my pledge is that the grad students can jump the queue if they to tell me in the chat that they want to say something. So I think we're going to go now to Ken Owen, who's shown great forbearance in waiting to ask about Pennsylvania legislation. Ken.
Well, I know that not only the visitors from the visitors from Missouri, but the visitors from the UK have probably heard enough of me talking about Pennsylvania over the years to want to throw in a question. I guess I've got two. One's a quick one about Pennsylvania, which is, if I understood you correctly, you're talking about the General Assembly laws after the Constitution, and I just wondered, is there anything that's particularly identifiable to you as a change in 1790 when the structure of state government in Pennsylvania changes? And the building on that, you made me realize that a lot of what I talk about in the 1790s probably falls into your criticism of being too distracted by what's going on a national level, in that a lot of my examples are from the executive relationship with the federal government and actions in the 1790s. But at the same time, the challenge that's going on at that point is that Pennsylvanian citizens are trying to work out how to adapt their quite responsive popular governmental structures to new institutions, both on a state and a federal level. And so that apparatus of popular sovereignty that they develop in the revolutionary years now has to be applied to controlling not just a new governor in Pennsylvania, but to a new federal level, both in legislative and executive elections. And so I wondered, is one of the things that that needs to be thought about here the difference between how people relate to executive and legislative power? Because I think one of the reasons I did end up concentrating on that executive level is that to me, by 1790, they've got the institutions in place that help them run legislative elections, but how to bridge that gap between popular sovereignty and executive power is less developed by the time the 1790s is reached.
All right, I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer to that second question. The rather limited analysis that I did, I mean, the key thing there for me was to try and see if I could see a pattern in legislative behavior that would show me that a state assembly was a different entity than Congress in terms of what it focused on. So that is what I was doing, and I employed a classification schema that has been developed actually by historians of the British Parliament, and you can have all kinds of critique against that because we're dealing with quite different societies. The good thing about it is that it's very, very detailed. So it helped me. It gave me a long list of different types of the subject matter of different types of laws. And what struck me turning to Pennsylvania at first, I had a bit of a shock because the first of these assemblies that I looked at was extremely focused on federal matters, on finance, on the public debt, and all the kinds of things that I'd seen Congress do. So the distinction didn't work for that first assembly, and it made me quite worried. But when I looked further in a longer time period, it seems that that was really an outlier when Pennsylvania was dealing with these changes happening at the federal level, sorting out the national debt, and also sorting out things like how they would relate to the new federal government, and that required a fair bit of legislation. When I looked at the full period, it's still only 8 years. Some of the most striking things about the activity in Pennsylvania is the frequency of creating and reshaping election districts, the incorporation of boroughs, the incorporation of counties. There's also quite a lot of legislation on roads, a bit on canals, and an awful lot of legislation regulating dams. Affecting public waterways essentially, and giving people permission to build dams. So the Pennsylvania Assembly, I had material from the British colleagues working on Parliament, so they gave me the data for the 1790s in Britain. Pennsylvania looks much more like the Parliament of Britain in terms of subject matter of legislation than Congress does. And Congress really stands out when comparing the three in its relative lack of interest in social and economic regulation. We're hoping, I'm working with a colleague at Queen Mary so on expanding this study, and where we actually hope to keep Pennsylvania as the case we're looking at. So it would be great if I could be in touch with you about this later on. What we were trying to do is then study many more years than just these 8, and compare it. We'll continue to compare it with the federal government or Congress and with Parliament, but hopefully adding more states as we go along. Right, I'm sorry, I wish I knew more. I find Pennsylvania fascinating, but you know, as Jeff was saying, I've been a top-down guy, so I haven't read as much as I should about the states, although I'm convinced now that that's actually where you should head if you're a graduate student.
Okay, we got a graduate student, Mary Grace Newman's going to jump on to ask a question. Then to lay it out here, I've got Connor Ewing and then Nicholas Cole. That's the next 3. So, Mary Grace.
Yes.
Hello, thank you for your talk on your paper. I really enjoyed it. I was just curious about one of your interventions that you're recommending to historians and how your own research is going to help bring about that emphasis. And so with the idea of historians exploring questions over rights and liberty by turning away from the US Constitution, I was wondering, in your larger project, do you plan to include or explain how marginalized groups turn toward other countries or empires for rights and liberty? And if so, how do those groups turning toward other political systems impact the American Union?
That's a good question, thank you. I believe I will be quite restricted to the material, by the material that I'm using right now. So there's going to be a lot on naturalizations of people coming in, not very much on people going out. So that's the main area that I'm struggling with in the project is that these law professors, for some reason, which I don't quite understand, seem to have no interest in the West. So they're not saying anything about the Western territories, even the ones who have kids who themselves are law professors heading out into the West, and they come from states like Virginia, where a lot of people are aiming to go out into the federal territory. So there should be, the stuff that I'm studying, these are textbooks essentially. So they're training, is material they use to train new lawyers. And we know that a lot of them would, looking for work would head out west. So your question about, no, I suppose I won't be able to capture them in this material, but it's a good point. And I think it would tell us a lot about the United States and the kind of society that was created, and about the people who weren't welcome, who didn't find a place in this new state. But yeah, I'll keep it in mind, and I'll think about possible ways to see if I can somehow work it in, because it's a good observation, I think. So, thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Connor.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Max. This is a great talk. Really looking forward to this book, to put it alongside the other Edling books in the collection. Earlier, we got pretty close to dispensing with the founding, so I want to pull us back a little bit and maybe ask a question from the political science and especially the constitutional theory, American political thought side of things. There are two big questions, so feel free to focus on one or to take them as you will. The first has to do with, I think it was the chapter 3 of the manuscript, which is the conceptual history of internal police. And there you described, I think rightly, the agreement between Federalists and anti-Federalists. But I found it interesting how you described this agreement. So on the one hand, you said that there was agreement about what the states were supposed to do. And then later on, you said there's an agreement about what they would do. And it seems to me that there's a big difference between these two options, between supposed to and would. So that, to put a point on it, the question here is, were internal police, and as that developed in the early period into police powers, at least at a jurisprudential level, were internal police principled restraints on national power or practical limitations? Do we see different groups with different understandings? How does that distinction play out, if it is a relevant distinction? The second question, I think, is related to this, and you mentioned it just very briefly at the outset, setting up the enumerated powers of the Constitution. So the question is, what is the meaning or significance of enumerated powers in your understanding? And I ask this, it's informed by work, ongoing work like Jonathan Guynap's, who focuses on distinctions in essentially between the fact of enumeration and enumeration as what became a legal canon. It became a set of limitations and formal restraints on political power. So as far as your understanding and account, going all the way back to revolution in favor of government, but as carried forward here, I think a little bit, what is the significance of enumerated powers?
Thank you. Good questions. Again, I'm not sure if I can answer them. As to your first question, I believe that the possibility, I mean, for police regulations to happen, you first have to have the legislation, right? And then you have to have some sort of bureaucracy that is able to put this law into effect. And there's really no such thing in the early period, I would say, apart from the West, where you do have at least a small administrative presence of the federal government. But I think also that there wouldn't really have been much interest in these matters at the national level. It's not, there's a kind of hierarchy when people write about governmental powers, where some are associated with sovereignty and some are considered to be important for things like glory and fame, and police tend to be this quite mundane thing that hard to see why anyone a statesman at the federal level would take any real interest in that kind of legislation. It would be meddling, I guess, at fairly low levels of government activity. So I'm not sure. Suppose would do. I mean, what I'm in the legislation chapter, I'm going a little bit towards what was actually done, but of course I don't look at the implementation. A lot of that legislation in the States was aspirational rather than anything else. It didn't necessarily translate into any actions. So I guess I'm the book. I'm at the level of ideas of how this relationship should look, and it may be that it wasn't the way it turned out always, but I'm not really in a position to answer that in a good way. Enumerated powers, I guess I've not thought this through nearly as thoroughly as I ought to. It, to me, it's just the idea that you have a list of activities that the federal government is allowed to do, and when it goes beyond those, it's fair to question it. But no, I've not looked at this from a juridical standpoint at all, which is maybe something I should. I can certainly see why it becomes a critical question in discussions about how far the federal government can go in different cases of legislation. So this is a poor answer. I'm sorry, but yeah, good questions.
Nicholas.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Max. I'm hugely sympathetic to two impulses of this project. One, focusing on the activities of state governments, and secondly, thinking about the family and units like that as in tension with the idea of just simply individual citizens as the sort of fundamental unit of the republic. But I worry a little bit about an anachronism in language that I'm really blaming Gary Gerstle for, which is this focus on this phrase police power, which doesn't appear in 18th century legal textbooks in Britain or America at all, because Marshall invents it in 1827. And it's a 19th century view of a description of what states did that emerges in America precisely when federal courts are trying to work out what the distinction is between state and federal power. And when people at state level are worrying that federal corporations like the National Bank are interfering with their internal markets, or tariffs are interfering with their internal markets. So I just worry that there's a sort of linguistic anachronism in sort of using this idea of police power so strongly when the Federal Convention doesn't talk about it because nobody's framed it. You do see it in the American West in their state conventions in the late 19th century when they talk about this a lot. And you see it in the 14th, 15th, and 13th Amendment discussions. But you don't see it in the early period because it's not a phrase they have available. And I'm not sure it's therefore an organizing concept that their lawyers are talking about. So I just worry about that as a sort of way of organizing it.
Yes. So in the book, I'm not making use of Marshall, and I'm not making use of the doctrine of police powers at all. I go to various places where the term police, not police powers, I'm sure you're correct about that. These European authors don't normally talk about internal police. They tend speak about police only. So there's a group of people in Germany just working on something called Kameralwissenschaft. There's a school of thought in France focusing on city regulation, and there's also the phrase police, and the distinction between that and other types of governmental activities is quite frequent in natural law thinkers, and finally you find them in early works on political economy in Britain. That's also a place where police is used quite often. So Adam Smith was probably the best or most enlightening of the thinkers I read on this. And in terms of secondary stuff, actually Foucault, although he's not a person I read a lot, he's done really interesting work on the concept of police in early modern Europe and early modern France. So yes, you are right. I think that police powers isn't there, but the concept itself, police, the term and the concept is there to define a certain type of government activity. And as I said previously, often at the local as much as at the state level.
I'm sure it's used as a sort of form of regulation. I've not seen it used to distinguish federal and state power until later, and so I'm sure it's in political thought, but it's not being used by lawyers in the early period to make
that may well be true. I make a note of when I read these law books. I make a note whenever the term appears, but I've not looked at it systematically. What I did for the book was look at newspapers, and it's not much in pamphlets. The newspapers in America in these years surrounding the founding, you can do word searches, throwing up police there. And then record of the Constitutional Convention, of course, ratification debate is quite a lot there. And a lot of these former protests against Parliament, you find that they use that. We tend to focus so much on taxation. It's actually very often taxation and internal police is the objection. Parliament should deal with these things. What else? Yeah, and then in terms of the broader intellectual context, it's these European discourses, maybe the best term to describe them. But no, for this chapter, I did not use the works of legal writers.
Okay, Max, I know it's getting late over there. We're gonna your port is within sight, but we're gonna keep you steaming for just a couple more here. We got a couple more questions. Chris Deutsch has been waiting patiently. Chris.
Greetings. I'm a postdoc at the University of Missouri doing 20th century history, and I'm really intrigued by where your next work proposes to go. So I was wondering if your work will seek to explain how, like, that household governance that you hinted at as maybe being where rights and the big story kind of is, where you think it might be, as practice, as maybe opposed to metaphor, kind of moves from the household to the federal government to kind of connect where you started with where you might be going.
Yes, I mean, I think this is true of all Western democracies, that the household government is a term that I encountered in Carol Shammas's work, and it's had a huge impact on my thinking about these matters. But it's not a concept that I've encountered a lot in other places, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And I think what it is a kind of division of distribution of rights, maybe in a group, and you can see traces of that to this day. At least that's what I tell my students, and I think the story is the same in most places. That what happens in the 19th century is that reformers turn to the state, both at state level and federal level, to try and break up household governments. So they move out things like poor relief, healthcare from the household. As Simmons points out in her book, the states remove the right of the father or parent to control the education of children. Women in the 19th century do get rights to property again, thanks to state intervention. And when we get further on, then in the US, the federal government comes to play a role, but that's way later. And I would say that a lot of political struggles going on at the moment are attempts to roll back the dismantling of household government and to build it up again. And that, depending on your political perspective, can be a great thing or a quite worrying thing. But you know, it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in this is that I guess because I'm a father, for good reason. I felt this was an important thing. It makes you think about a lot of stuff having to do with your role in family and where that role comes from, I guess, and how it's, at least in the past, was propped up by laws and government. So one thing I want to say before I conclude this answer is that I really think that the early American republics are about propping up household government to a large extent, and making that household government work is the central concern of these American republics. Okay, thanks.
Okay, all right. The last question is going to go to Al.
Hi, Max. I had a question actually going back to the kind of the broader framing and the historiographical pushback you have to the extension of the federal government's powers with the Constitution. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about Indigenous affairs in particular, because it seems to strike me as interesting in two ways. One, you talk about how the federal government is supposed to deal with foreigners, which the legal status of Indigenous peoples within the United States is obviously something that's actually not figured out in this time period, not figured out for a long period of time. And so in some ways it fits into foreign, right? It's under the War Department. They're the ones who can make treaties. But some of these treaties and land sales are within the bounds of a US state, not the Western territories. And so I'm curious where it fits in with this fact that you've moved from states being able to make treaties to it has to be on the federal level, but it can be within the bounds of a state, not even actually beyond it. But I'm also just curious, you know, what it means when something that you're addressing as being kind of a foreign power is something that's taking place within the states themselves. So I'm not talking about Kentucky, I'm not talking about Tennessee in periods of territory, but I'm talking about Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, New York. So where this kind of fits, since that does seem to be a big shift from 1789, 1790 forward versus the Revolutionary period.
Right, thank you. You may have seen Gautam Rao's piece in the William and Mary Quarterly a while back, where he speaks about how new scholarship on the state can be used to discuss or analyze relations and the history of American Indians. In the larger project that I want to develop, I had this idea that I'm going to divide the early US into three legal spaces or main spaces. One would be the ocean, one would be the heartland of the 13 republics, one would be the Western marshlands. And what's interesting about the third of these is, as you say, the presence there of peoples who are living within the borders, international borders of the United States, but are clearly not part of the nation or the people. and who have a curious status. You also have the early territories that also have a very strange status if you compare them to the republics. They're certainly not the same, although I mean it's transitory status, but they're different. So I had this idea that I would approach the early US as a composite state or composite early modern composite empire, where you have all kinds of different jurisdictions within this larger structure. You're pointing to, if I understand you correctly, to the status of American Indian people, nations within the republics, right? Is that what you're after? I don't know enough about this. I've maybe assumed that Leonard Sadowski was right when he spoke about this transfer of power from the states to the federal government over American Indian affairs. Of course, I'm aware of the presence of strong American Indian nations in places like Georgia, for example. So it's something that I hope to look more at in the future. And one thing you said that I find very interesting, that I've also struggled with, is again, Nick mentioned Marshall, and I think the way we think about these American Indian nations is colored very much by views expressed in the early decades of the 19th century. And I would love to recapture what people actually thought in 1789 and 1790 about these peoples and about the future and about the role in the American Federal Union. Because as you said, I don't think it's determined at the time. But I find it, I've read the secondary literature and I've not found a lot of good discussions about this. So if you have any suggestions, I would be most grateful if you could give me some reading tips. I think this will come later. I'm going to try and do what I call the heartland first, and then hopefully do something on the West. But I'm not sure how to do it and with what type of sources. So again, not a very good answer, but a very good question. So thank you for that.
Okay, well, Al will set you an essay on that, Max, and you have some homework to do. Last question before we send you off. I was just curious, with your kind of take on the Constitution and what you were saying, that the sort of treaty and the Unionist stuff. Does when you look back, does the Articles of Confederation look any different, viewed through that vantage, through that prism?
Yes, I mean, I think you have the basic division of power there already. You have the idea of a federal union, the idea of what the United States, I think, was intended to be at the time of the founding. But at the same time, it does have these rather serious flaws that I guess people should have been able to spot from the very beginning. It's hard to have a functioning federal union without a union government. I think that's a basic flaw. I think the idea of voluntary contributions was always going to be problematic, and I think they probably saw it, but the appetite for a centralized regime wasn't very strong, having just rebelled or being in the midst of a rebellion against Britain, right? So yes, I think my story is about continuity to quite a large extent.
Okay, well, we're going to let you off now, Max. You've showed great stamina late on a Friday night. I want to echo what Nicholas Cole said in the chat about now we're all excited about this, but we got to wait now for the book, right? We got to wait. When's the book come out? When's it come out?
December is what I've been told.
Okay, so we don't have to wait that long.
No,
but
it's going to be a wonderful Christmas gift.
Yeah, it's a great Christmas gift.
yes, okay, good. Well, everybody, let's thank Max Edling for a wonderful paper. Thank you so much, Max. Jeff, did you want to say anything about our next session?
Well, sure. It's thanks for running this, Jay. My arm feels much better. And actually, I really enjoyed just listening to them. And that it turns out. Next week, 3:30, back to the regular time. It'll be more of a political science, political theory side, where Professor Aurelian Creatu is going to be of Indiana University. Is going to be talking about moderation in America. Can we find it? I'm not sure. We'll see. That's going to be and probably Constantine Vassilio probably be like engaging with Professor Creatu, and then the Haitian Revolution the week after that. So lots of exciting things coming up. So thank you, Jay, and thanks, Max, for the very stimulating early afternoon / late evening.
Well, thank you, everyone, for participating and for asking brilliant questions. That I can promise you that even if I can't answer them, I will take them with me and think about them, and they will shape my work in the future. So thanks, everyone.